So here's Main Street.
Oh, that's a nice spot.
There's the bank building. And let's just roll back in time here. So we got June 2024. Then we could go 2023. Then we could go 2019. Then we can go 2016, 12, 2009, and 2008. And so you can imagine something like that, right? Rather than stopping at 2008, we're able to go back much, much further. Welcome to the Annovation podcast. So today we are talking about tech communication and genealogy. And to do that, I've got Lauren here, and I'll hand it over to Lauren in a second. Lauren is doing a class on tech communication. And when we say tech communication, I like to break that down to understand what is tech. So tech is kind of the tools that we use to build things. And then technology, the ology part, is the study of that. So then if you look at technology, it's the study of the tools that we use to build things. Now, breaking this down in this course that Lauren's been taking, what's a little bit about tech communication and what you're learning in that class?
Hi, Alec. It's so good to be here. So I'm taking some grad school classes on the side because I am excited about communications more broadly, but this class is on emergent media and technology. And so that means this class is about the implications of new technologies and their applications, and that's from a usability perspective rather than a scientist or engineer's perspective. And so it's a really interesting dive into how communication technologies become accessible to everyday people and how we talk about the tools that we're using, not just historically, but the new tools that are coming out.
And I mean, that kind of seems to be the general trend of technology, right? Is these technology tools make something that was really hard to do a little bit easier and a little bit more accessible to everyone. And then there was this term that we started talking about that was emergent media, right? Could you tell me a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
So emergent media is, I think, such an interesting exploration of how these communication technologies become accessible. So that accessibility piece is really interesting to me because it's not just the scientists, it's not just the people who have a more advanced knowledge, but everyday people can use these tools to do things that previously required specialized knowledge and expertise. And this changes who gets to participate in creating and sharing stories.
Well, yeah, when I think of that, the thing that immediately comes to mind is, well, one, this podcast, it's way easier for me to do this podcast than it would be 20 years ago. But the Sawyer on Water podcast, which is another podcast that I work on and help with, that podcast, we actually shoot that podcast and record it all on the river. And so we were actually on rafts and like doing this as we go down the river. And that really seems to me to embody emergent media because that's that barrier of media coming down where before you might have a whole huge camera setup and things like that. It would be a lot harder to handle the mics, especially around putting mics around water like that, where they might get splashed or someone might fall in the water. Luckily, we haven't had that happen yet. But those are all things that I think are very evident of emergent media. Just as the technology gets better and better, as it becomes easier and easier to create a podcast, we can actually do that we can actually do that now on the water because it is that simple.
And that's such a beautiful image because I think about, the idea of, okay, we're recording an episode. It's got to be in a studio. It needs to have all these specific elements to, no, actually, there's a very different image of you're sitting on a raft. Is it a raft or fishing boat? What kind of boat are you on the water with Sawyer?
Well, so it's a two-person raft, so it's an R2. So we actually have the guests paddling typically most of the time. Guest and the host are both paddling. We can run in a couple different ways because you're on a boat. So, but it's very interesting because that's not something that's possible if you didn't have the technology at that level. Where we're actually, as the setup is as compact as like an iPhone and two small like lapel mics. So
That's awesome. So you've taken it from the studio to this little raft on the water and breaking down those barriers that instead of having it be a very formal affair, it's a very human moment where you're on the water. The guest is paddling. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it allows you to capture a more human moment as well, because it's like the technology is not as much the forefront of what that recording process is all about. It's not about the technology. It's that recording process is really about telling the river story in the way that the river story feels authentically feels like it could be authentically told, really
Mhm.
on the water in a way that, you would normally hear a river story or you would want to hear a river story. But when you think about emergent technology, what are some other examples that might pop out to people?
So, one of the ways that I'm using more of these emerging technologies is also not necessarily normal. So, I recently got into genealogy work, as you previewed at the beginning here, but I'm using some newer tools in order to make this interesting, engaging, not just for myself, but ideally for future generations, to engage with the story of my family and to really bring together the generations from my grandfather, who is a great storyteller, as long as you have a lot of time to sit down with him, and using the emerging technologies in a place that is a little bit less common. So that's something that comes to mind for me.
Excellent. Well, and that's kind of how this started. Is we were down in Independence, Oregon, for a family reunion, and you've been doing quite a lot of work on kind of the family history and working with we're cousins, so our grandfather, who is kind of telling that story and getting and gathering that story of our family history. And really this concept of technology allowing you to do that a lot simpler, effectively allowing you to do the role of the genealogist, but bringing that barrier way, way down. So like how do you do that? How did you get started with that first?
So the idea of bringing the barrier way down is the only reason that I could do any of this. So let me tell you that story. I know that you and I both grew up hearing these fantastic stories from our grandfather, and there's all kinds of fun anecdotes that I remember of were related to the founders of this town and independence. And I always thought, man, this is so cool. Like I wish I could engage more, but growing up I got to go back to school. I got to go to practice, as I'm a busy kid and now I'm a busy adult and I was so grateful to realize that I could record these stories without having to take notes. So the first thing that I started doing was using the voice recording app in my phone. There's also a similar app called Otter that does a lot of the summarizing for you. But I essentially just said, "Okay, Grandpa, keep telling me your stories. Keep saying what you're saying, but let me just." Record on the side if you're cool with that. And that changed everything because it went from me being like, that's a cool story, but I got to do my next thing, to that's a cool story. Let me record it. And then when I have another moment, I could sit down with that recording and really parse through what are the key points here and how can I retell this story. So once I had amassed enough recordings, I was able to reflect and I needed some technology in order to process that information. Transcripts can be pretty messy. So I went to my favorite AI assistant, Claude, which helped me summarize, pull out the key points, and then I could go back to my grandpa and go, wait a second, I had a question about this particular character in your story. Tell me more. So it really helped me understand the source material, helped me be present with him, and then helped me retell these stories in a way that I have a 18-month-old daughter, and she doesn't understand a whole lot yet, but I'm excited for repackaging in the way that emerging technology can help me repackage these stories so that hopefully they're interesting to her, even though she probably won't get a lot of time to interact with generations who have lived these stories.
I think when you think about the way what that story is extracted from, there's a whole bunch of books and things like that that really are the backbone of that story. You don't have time to read all the books. And it's very hard to go through all the books and get all those pieces. But when you can have it in a different form where you can just kind of go through the recordings, you can see the summaries right there, you can search them and pull out those points and those questions. You can start to engage deeper with the content rather than trying to hold it all up here in your mind.
Exactly. Yeah. So the first problem was that I needed a note taker, and so that was solved by having voice recordings. But then the second problem was I needed a research assistant, and so I've got this great voicemail from our grandfather Mick, who's like, "I've got all these binders, I've got all these documents, Lauren. You got to bring a really big sack. I've got all this information for you," and that. Most people, I feel like, know someone in their family or their friends who's really into genealogy, and you could just picture the boxes and boxes of family documents, pictures, artifacts, and there's sometimes a burden that comes with that information because you know this is important, but it's not really clear what to do with it. And so for me, the process of digitizing and then having some research assistants to help me pull through or parse through that information and pull out the most important pieces, it took away the burden and really made it so interesting and so accessible for me to dig into, because I could ask questions of the data once I had digitized this 300-page The Hill family history document and say, okay, actually, I want to know more about the story of the founding couple of independents, Henry and Martha Hill. But I don't just want to know the big, important, like, hero worship version of the story. I want to know more about, like, how they built community connections, and having that research assistant was so helpful and getting to know the full story, not just the story as it was immediately presented.
Hmm. Well, and you know what this kind of reminds me of? It reminds me a lot of like if you thought of how you used to do a research paper, they would say, go to the library, go get like 5 books, and then like read through all those books, and then write out your notes from the books, and then put it into your research paper. And you're marking up all these books and things like that. Really, it's kind of like when I was in school, I would go through the updated version of that where I would be able to use the internet. I still actually have some of the older research studies though, where like in elementary and middle school specifically, they would say, all right, you got to go to the library, you got to pick out the book sources and then do your work that way. It's a lot like that, going from books to internet sources, but for genealogy, being able to digitize that data and allow it to be searchable and actually in a way that you can use it more effectively.
And I found that so helpful too, to be able to say, okay, let's go back to these characters of Henry and Martha. What information is out there? How has the story been told before? And having a research system that could say, okay, let me go see what the stories of Henry and Martha are out there. And I wanted to try and bring a unique angle, especially having these additional family history documents. And my hypothesis was there wasn't a lot of information out there about women's leadership roles, but it was able to bring some additional context of what kind of research that I would need in order to tell the story in a unique way, and how I could dig back into those documents in a meaningful way. And so yeah, exactly. It is this shift from, I'm no longer pulling books off the shelf, in my home library, but instead I can digitize and really use the computer searchability. And then having that additional thought partner to bounce things off of allowed me to tell, I think, much more interesting stories, not just for myself, but for others. Some of the questions that I was able to unearth, I brought to the curator of the museum in Independence, Oregon, and she was able to dig through her notes and the additional connections that she has, and actually created a few new exhibits in the museum based on the research questions that I brought forth. And that was a really fantastic moment to feel like I asked questions that could help change the historical information available to folks, that would tell a story that was more of the strong women of independence and the way that they made history as well. And so that was a really neat connection from, just hearing these conversations with my grandfather to using these new tools that could help me make connections with other people in the real world. And I was quite proud of that.
Well, I think there's so much more history than what is the stuff in the museum. So I think that's a really important one. I mean, there's probably someone out there listening to this who's like, oh yeah, we got this great family story. That family story is something that, only a couple people actually know because it sits in those books and they don't talk about it too much. It might be interesting to try and figure out how can you get that family story out there and in a medium that's easier to be consumed, whether that's a video, whether that's a podcast even, whether that's some type of museum exhibit might be a little hard, but if it's a really good story, I'm sure people will be interested. So,
And you got to start somewhere. And Alec, it makes me think of some of the work that you've done to help these images come alive. And I know that I've played a little bit with this problem of I wanted better pictures of my ancestors. So there's a few really fantastic pictures, and then there's a few important characters that I just have grainy, horrible pictures of, but I wanted to understand them better. So I went through this journey of, okay, so ChatGPT can create new images, and I made some pretty terrible images unintentionally of my ancestors because I think I gave pretty loose guidelines, and they went straight to the uncanny valley. And they took a picture and reimagined it in such a way that the eyes were a little too bright, the hair was a little bit too detailed, and I had to really dial it back to say, no, I want this photo to be a respectful representation of my ancestors instead of a reimagining that makes them look, attractive in a modern day. Not interesting to me at all. And so I wanted to hear a little bit of your tips, because I think that you did some really cool work while we were in the museum lifetime of saying, imagine this picture a little more modern, and it resonated with people in a way that was really cool. So I'd love to hear more about that.
And just for anyone listening, the uncanny valley is when something looks very human, but it's not quite right. So it's kind of like it's approaching close enough to human, but it's a little bit off, so we feel uncomfortable about it. It's like if you looked at a robot's probably fine, but if you looked at a very human-looking robot, it gets a little weird, and it sets off our like, oh, that doesn't look quite right. It's like a human that's sickly or something.
Mm.
Um, so I think that just to define the uncanny valley. And then your second part of your question, though, is that piece on technology and how it can enhance the experience. We we very often forget that just because we see those black and white photos and we see maybe the portrait that's a painted portrait or something like that, they lived lives that looked in the same HD color and everything that we lived in, that we live in today. They were able to basically, if they had the cameras that they could capture, they would be full color pictures and all of that, and like they lived that type of life. And sometimes when you see it through that black and white photo, it doesn't look that way. Your mind doesn't connect that as much. And so one of the things that we were doing in the museum is using generative AI. We would take a picture of the black and white photo and we would say, all right, add color to this. And it really changes your perspective on it. When you add that color, you start to see, okay, what does this scene actually look like? And it allows you to connect with it more because it looks more like your life today. It looks more like the world that you're used to when it has that color. So we don't see things in black and white. So it's very interesting, and I think it's pretty easy to do now, because as the emergent media and emergent technology has come out, the difficulty level of going and actually taking and adding color to a photo has gone from, you have to be doing Adobe Photoshop and all that and go in and actually edit it, to you take a picture of it, you upload it to Gemini or Claude or ChatGPT, and then you tell it to add color to the photo. And is it super accurate? Maybe, maybe not. Depends. Is it going to be everything that the professional Adobe Photoshopper is doing? Probably not. But the fact that you can kind of start to see that all those images in that color, and it connects you to it more, I think is incredibly important.
And Alec, I liked what you were doing with the photos in particular, because by giving the command specifically of colorize this photo, it kept all the other details the same and instead brought some of the more human aspects, rosy cheeks or even like the color of the dog, really popped out of the photo in a way that allowed us to connect with it. And it makes me think of that wall in our grandparents' house that has all these family photos. I remember as a kid looking at that wall and thinking, I wonder when the world became in color. I wonder when the world went from being in black and white to being in color, because I didn't realize that it was just the technology that had us seeing these images in a different way. And instead I thought, it suddenly the whole world changed. But the ability to go back and say, okay, I want to see our ancestors the same way that I might see someone sitting right in front of me, and in those details, in a way that feels respectful and in a way that isn't that uncanny valley that turns you away, is such a fantastic thing to put in reach, because even before there was Adobe Photoshop, people would colorize photos. You would probably work with an artist who was trained in this, who would be bringing the pigments specifically to tiny aspects of the photos, and that sort of artistry, the fact that it is more accessible now, is really fantastic. But the photos piece, I think, has a lot of room for improvement, just because, as we talked about a little bit, there were some issues that we encountered, but it really had a lot of potential, I think, to make history come alive.
And it's certainly not perfect. And to get to the specific tools that we used, we're recording this at the time where Nano Banana came out for Gemini, which actually is a much better photo editing tool than previous AI image generators. So a lot of the AI image generators before this would just take the whole photo and change it entirely. Now this allows you to actually do more AI photo editing, which is what allowed us to actually be able to do that. But it's very interesting because this is the technology today in 2025. But imagine what the technology is like later on down the line. When you're looking maybe 5 years out from now or 10 years out from now, you take that same photo. What can you do with it then? I think of like the the concepts of AI where it's in educational applications being able to talk to presidents and things like that, and it's trained on all their writing. And that seems like something really interesting for genealogy down the line is how do you bring the characters to life again so that you can kind of they can talk to you and they can share some of their stories in what might be their voice. You probably don't have a video or an audio recording, but there's a lot of ways that you can kind of bring bring that bring that character into the present day in a way that they can actually talk to you in a way. What do you think of that?
So I feel like that is another neat evolution of something that we experienced in a more low-tech way. So when we went to the family reunion in Independence, the curator of the museum was dressed up as one of the founders. And that was a neat way to sort of experience history and see it come alive. But this idea of you can interact with it more in a video format, I think that in some way it's a little creepy, and maybe that is like for me, I'm used to people dressing in costume. That feels very normal, but this idea of like, oh, I could talk to them as if they're alive. And so I'm still sorting out because part of my mission with my genealogy work is to make history come alive. And I think that, so I'm not exactly sure why it's a little odd to me, but I'm curious to see how that evolves because it's in line with what I'm interested in.
Mhm. I mean, I think we'll get there. It feels uncomfortable right now because it feels far away.
Mm,
Um, and we've all seen like bad AI generated things, and it's this curve of it will get better, but the first iterations are probably not going to feel comfortable. But if you look 5, 10 years out, there's going to be a much better version at 5 years out than there will be at 10 years out. Or, well, wait, no, there's going to be a much better version at 5 years out, and then there's going to be an even better version 10 years out. That's
exactly.
just the
Yeah.
nature of technology. It just keeps getting better and better. So as you look at these technologies, that's the worst it'll be. So when you're thinking, okay, well, it's not great today, but it might get to the point where you walk into a museum and you're able to put on a VR headset and it feels like very much like almost a video game, but it's a full historical reenactment that you can walk through.
That's amazing. And I hear what you're saying about like, yeah, because you're seeing the very beginning of this. Of course, the technology is not that good, but imagine 5, 10 years down the road, and a much more complete version of this will take out a lot of the eerie or uncomfortable feelings.
I mean, what is it? There's so many book series on this, like Magic Treehouse or something like that, where you
Hmm.
just like you put on a VR headset and then like you are in that historical reenactment of something, and then like you're walking around another person who is also in that space, especially if you just did it where it's like augmented reality, where you still walk around the space, but the space has been changed. It could be a really interesting experience and a really interesting way to really connect with the history of somewhere and experience it in the way that it actually was created. It actually was back then. I mean, you can't get fully correct to exactly how it was, but you can get pretty close in a way that a photo or video can't. Yeah, you can kind of create this next level of the experience. And that's really where I think playing this out, what are the next levels up of the experience? And I think that gets into what I'm talking about with this VR type stuff and kind of the ways that the experience wraps around you a little bit more and comes to life a lot more than the
Yeah.
photos and the books and things like that.
And what I'm picturing, and just to kind of set the scene for the listeners, the city of Independence is a very cute little 10,000 person town. It has a lovely historic downtown with some new buildings, some old buildings, but Alec, as you're mentioning the augmented reality or mixed reality implications, I'm imagining being able to stand on that main street looking at the downtown and saying, okay, like, what did this look like 100 years ago? What did this look like 150 years ago? The buildings that exist today and having them blended with some of the, this building has stood for 100 years, and but also the rest of this was horse-drawn carriages. I think that would be a fascinating way to, as you're standing in the street, potentially look through history, and that would be it's not accessible now, but something that augmented reality might make possible. And you could almost see it when you're standing in that historic place that, like, I can kind of imagine superimposing these old photos, but actually being able to do it lifetime would be fascinating.
Mhm. Well, in a way, it kind of is accessible now in a version.
Mhm.
If you go on Google Maps, there's a time slider. And so you can actually slide back in time on some of these street view shots and see what it was like at this point in time, and then go 5 years back and 5 years back. You get around 2010 and earlier, it starts to get pretty grainy and hard to see those things. But you can actually use this slider to kind of get an idea of that. Just imagine you're using AI to more completely put that picture together, and really understand what that world might look like. And then you're actually creating that full slider that goes even further back, and you can kind of just step into history.
That's great, and instead of the beginning of time being 2010 where it gets too blurry and you can't really see what happened before, the beginning of time becomes much, much earlier. That no, I see the connection to what's already available and how that feels much more close at hand than I realized.
All right, we're going to do a detour. It's either going to work or it's not going to work. We're going to try and do this. If it's not successful and it doesn't fit, we will just jump from here to the next topic. So you the listener, you will know in just a second if we just start jumping on to the next thing or not. I'm going to try to do this for independence. I miss it. There it is. So we're going to go to Main Street here, and then we're just going to pop down the little guy right on Main Street. And then let's just see if we can roll back time. There, see more dates. So here's Main Street.
Oh, that's a nice historical
There's
thing.
the bank building. And let's just roll back in time here. So we got June 2024. Then we could go 2023. Then we could go 2019. Looks like it got a paint job there.
It changed colors. How fascinating.
Yeah. Then we can go 2018. Then we can go 2016, 2015, 2012, 2009, and 2008. And so you can imagine something like that, right? Where it's evolving over time, and you're kind of stepping through these different decades, but it goes, rather than stopping at 2008, we're able to go back much, much further.
That's
What do you
awesome.
think about that?
I think it is fascinating to see even, in the last, 15 years or so of the the way the city has changed, and the way that even just these images and rolling back in time could tell the story of, okay, so the bank got a paint job. Like, look at the cars and the streets and how they've changed, even just over this years. I would love to it removes any eerie feelings of seeing the street. For me, interacting with the founder in a video chat to me is like, oh God, like that to me is so far-fetched that I can't picture it. But like, because this is here, and readily available for me now, it it feels really exciting. And I'm like, oh, I wish I could just keep going back. Like, what did it look like, with these images? I know that the town of Independence experienced a renaissance in the 2000s. They had a fantastic mayor who was able to really, change the town from a place that had lost their main kind of industry into this cute little up and coming place that it is today. And I'd love to see what that transformation looked like and be able to live through it rather than just read about it. It's one other way to make it come alive.
Exactly. You're bringing it to life and bringing it in a way that allows people to uh, kind of experience it closer to what they can understand and what they can connect with.
Hmm.
All right, I'll end this thing, and then we'll get back to the regular part of the podcast. If you were an audio listener, I apologize. That was a little hard to keep track of, but what we were doing there is we went to Google Maps and we showed the main street of Independence, and we just stepped through time on it on Street View. So you can go and you can take the little person icon, drag it onto wherever you want. Different places are going to have different levels of data, but then you can look through all the different time periods of images of Street View at those different times. It's very cool. Highly recommend doing it for some of your favorite spots that you might want to step back in time for. And then imagine what you can do in the future with that type of thing, but you go a little bit further and you can go back at any other point, and it's just able to use probably some type of generative AI, something like that, to kind of stitch that together and understand what that place might look like at that time.
That's a great example, and I think that the Google Maps feature of getting to roll back in time, I've done when I am interested in visiting a place or moving to a place or even buying a house. I might say, okay, what was this neighborhood like? I can only roll back 15 years, but it's just to me, I think, a really neat application that's not just about understanding history because it doesn't quite roll back far enough yet. But with an historic place like Independence, there are tons of photos, so I think it would be possible to build something like that, and I would be curious to see more of it.
Have you heard of Google's Genie models?
No, tell me more.
So Google has these models called I think it's Genie 3 is their most recent one, and they're actually world models. And so what they're doing is they're actually generating worlds. And so effectively when you think of it like generating a video game, where you generate this you basically generate the world and it actually keeps memory of it too. You're walking around and you say, I want to be in this location. You give it a location or some type of scene, it generates the scene. But you can walk around in it and experience it. Now, once you're walking around in it and experiencing it, then you can go do whatever you want to add to the world. So you could say, all right, now add. So like let's say I want to be in a field, um, in a beautiful meadow in wherever you want to be. So you could say beautiful meadow, San Francisco or something like that, right?
Mhm.
So it gives you this beautiful meadow. And it might throw some scenery in the background and things like that. And then you say, all right, now I want to watch hot air balloons. And then it starts creating and adding hot air balloons into the world. And so right there, you have this world that you can just paint on and you can also experience because you can walk around in it like a video game. And that is quite interesting. And you can think of that for the historical context of, okay, so create me a world that looks like this. And then, oh, this photo will make this part of the world look like this. This photo, let's match this photo up over here. And so you're taking those photos and you're using those as reference points. And then you're going through the historical records of, maybe you have some building permit data, maybe you have some other data on stuff like that. And you're using that to construct the world. And then you've started to create this picture of what that place might look like at points in time. And you say,
That's
oh yeah, well, then this fire happened in this year and it took out this portion of the city. Or the flood that happened in Independence a long, long time ago, that
mhm.
one's going to be harder to do. But think about what that used to look like. Like right now, we do have like Colonial Williamsburg, for example. We have some like images and interesting videos and historical reenactments, but those are very hard to produce. But you may be able to do that at a much lower cost as well in the future if you have tools like Genie 3 at a very high level and things like that that are able to create these video representations and experiences.
And it's a fantastic example of like, okay, so this is already here in some way. And, whether that's a very pleasant experience of I want to be in a field in San Francisco and have hot air balloons. And that to me has some implications for, okay, I need to take a moment to relax. That would be a very relaxing place to be. I'm thinking about Golden Gate Park and just kind of being in that lovely scenario. But the idea of it being within this context of genealogy and history, it sounds like it's closer at hand than I realized.
hmm Well, and there's also the step into this photo feature,
Mhm,
which I think that has a really big implication for genealogy and things, where
mhm,
you think of how do you step into that world? How do you step into this photo? And there's a really weird Black Mirror episode that goes into this, but it goes into the dystopian version. But it is kind of neat where they actually go and he's stepping into photos to remember them. And
hmm.
it's basically allowing him to look at the photo and experience the photo, and then the AI asks him questions to try and help him remember and piece together the memories surrounding that photo. I just
Oh,
think that that's such an interesting concept that you could see start to exist as well.
that's fascinating.
So we are getting a ways away from genealogy, but let's get back to the core of what's sort of the core of genealogy and what it's doing, and what are those things that never will probably never change in genealogy.
It's, I think, a great question because my husband teases me because he's like, when a man gets to a certain age, he has to choose: is he going to focus on the Roman Empire or World War II? And for me, it's like, okay, like I've gotten to a certain age, I'm in my 30s, and now I'm really into genealogy. I thought it would take a little longer, but here I am, and it is a part of trying to connect with people who have passed away to better understand yourself, and to better understand where you came from, because the stories that you grew up with were not always the full story. And to me, it's a great way of understanding these people who've lived full lives in different contexts. But how can I learn from the mistakes that they've made as well as the successes that they've had? And how can I apply that to my life? So as far as what is the core of genealogy for me, it really is this digging into the past in order to better understand the present. And I know that people become involved in their family history and genealogy for a number of different reasons. But what I think is never going to change about it is really this idea of it helps us connect to people, whether they are in front of us or whether they have passed away recently or even decades ago. And it is the artifacts that we carry with us, whether that's the physical boxes that might be somewhat overwhelming, or it could be digital artifacts that are easier to parse through, but don't give us as clear of a sense um, of the people and the lives they lived. That was one thing that really struck me in visiting the Museum in Independence after having done all this research and really trying to figure out how to understand the stories of my ancestors and to retell them to get the current generations interested in them. But I thought I knew the stories through and through, back to front, and that I wasn't going to get a whole lot more from going to the museum. But that actually was not true, because the moment I walked into the museum, it was such an immersive experience that you really don't get as much through a screen. And it was the musicians that were playing at the museum that really set the tone, but it was also getting to see the physical objects, the dresses, the original photos with the frames and the tools that had a sense of spirit or even the souls of the people that use them that I wasn't able to get through my research. So I think that even though emerging technology allows this genealogy work to be more efficient, less burdensome, and also a lot more accessible to the average person who might be doing it as a side project. What isn't going to change is the reality of connecting with physical objects is always going to bring a new aspect to it. And that I want to continue to remember as someone who works remotely, who lives a lot of my life through this computer screen, that there really is these in-person elements that can't be replaced.
Mhm. Well, and I think there's versions of that where it's you're connecting with the world that's around you. It may be VR feels very real. You might not touch and feel every object though. You might see them.
Mhm.
And I think of what this reminds me of is we have that phrase emergent media, and the driving down of that, making it so you used to have to do that at a highly specified level.
Mhm.
Now you're coming down and it's a lot more accessible to a lot more people. When you think of that, there's also this way that you can make media more immersive too through that, where before you might write it and it might be written word in a book, right? But you can bring that book alive into a video, or you could bring that alive into a podcast. You could take that book and video and bring it alive as an AI recreation of that character. You could even create that as a world down at some point. And so there's this driving down of the difficulty it takes to create that immersive experience. Just another lens of that media becoming more available is that connection that you can have with the media can become easier to make.
Mhm. And that's such an important piece because I think that one of the reasons that genealogy or history is not accessible or not interesting is that people don't see themselves in the stories that are reflected. And the more that you can see yourself, rather, that might be from actually being immersed in it, or finding some other ways to connect, then that is truly the way that these stories remain relevant.
I like to think of it as you could immerse yourself, or you could immerse yourself by kind of putting yourself into the space, or you could kind of imagine yourself and you can put yourself in their space as well. So if you read a book and you read it trying to understand the character, um, while also having your context of you, right? That's an interesting experience where you're kind of connecting with it from a different way. You don't have all this fancy VR stuff all around you, but you're kind of reading it to connect with the character and what were they thinking, how were they feeling, how were they experiencing. I think it's quite interesting because it's very easy to get the textbook version of the person's life, but they have just as complex a life. Well, there's some other things that we have today that are a little bit weirder, but they had complex lives and complex emotions and things like that and a lot of stuff going on. And, they had good days, they had bad days, they had all kinds of stuff. And it's just like they were still running the same hardware in between our ears. So
And
it's
I
pretty
think
interesting to see how the hardware adapts.
Right, and I think that, recent media such as, I mean, this is not so recent anymore, but when Hamilton came out, not just as a play, but also, something that you could watch on your TV at home, that really showed that there is this appetite to understand historical figures, not just in their textbook versions, as you said, but also as humans, as much more tangible, real people who had flaws, and that didn't make them any less of a hero, it just made them more of a real person, and that these technologies can help us engage with the people in our own families that we want to better understand as people, and really to get all those details of their lives and think about what they were thinking and how they were experiencing their lives, and not just the most top line, most important pieces that have been preserved.
Like you can't empathize with the statement of like basically George Washington was the first president of the United States. There's no empathy there.
Hmm.
That statement is just a historical fact and you can't empathize with it. But if you start to pull apart his historical things, you can really start to understand the character and connect with him. And you can actually create that empathy because there's more complexity to just the historical headline or the historical facts. And often what we test a lot of kids with in history is all the historical facts, but it's like it would be much I think it's a much more vibrant experience to test on how, what was this character like? What do you think about how does this character connect with you? This person living in today versus this human who lived in this time period.
And just the idea of what lessons from their experience are still applicable today, and how can that really make connections across generations and bring people together. I think that's one of the most promising aspects of this work for me, is that it's digging into what might be historical facts, but trying to say, these people wrestled with very similar things, whether it's career decisions, what are they going to do with their life to bring meaning, to pay for their lifestyle, or relationship decisions, or building a family decisions. These are very classic building blocks that we all have to assemble in our own lives and make a series of decisions about, but that people have gone through for a long time. So there's a lot of wisdom out there if we could tap into it.
I mean, there's so many parenting books, technically. I
Yeah.
mean, because that throughout all of human history, we've been parenting. So it'd be interesting to see all those different perspectives and all those different challenges of how they do that. This last piece that I want to get to is you are doing not just posting this on, you're not like making Facebook posts or something. You're not writing a book or anything. You're posting this on Substack. And we had this funny moment in the family reunion where they were like, what is a Substack? And I've got that question several times as well as I've got more into my Substack as well. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how you're talking about this genealogy stuff.
Definitely. And I was tickled by that moment as well, Alec, because in part of the work that I mentioned, it's so motivating to me, is really making this information accessible. And I know that there's been a number of members of my family who've really done a lot of this genealogy work that I'm able to stand on their shoulders. And the classic move is, okay, I'm gonna write about the family history, I'm gonna put it in a binder, I'm gonna print it out, it's gonna look beautiful. And we've got a lot of those, which I'm so grateful for. But also it can add to the sort of the sense of overwhelm of like, oh my gosh, I have so much respect for this person who wrote this. I want to read it and with what time. So what I did with the work was I wanted to put it online because that's what our generation does is okay, so I'm not going to physically write something and print it out and put it in a binder. I'm going to post it somewhere, and a Substack is a great platform for making a website as well as blog posts, and it really takes a lot of that what used to be more advanced technology of you have to be pretty tech savvy in order to have it look professional and in order to put it out there for your audience, for your family, for your friends. This Substack does a lot of just integrating. It could be podcasts, it could be blog posts, and really integrating that all into one space. And as I wrote about the family history and told these stories, I shared it out and I made different posts on my Substack. And I was so flattered because our great aunt was so just enthralled by the Substack and the stories that she was like, perhaps this generation can be called the Substack generation. And it tickled me because I thought, okay, I don't want our generation to be defined by a technology because that feels way too limiting. But I do love the idea that our generation is using technology to tell stories and to connect people, and that this was one platform that allowed a lot of people to connect, even people who I might have never met or I haven't seen since I was a little kid. And I'm very proud of that compliment actually, because I love that I was seen as someone who could use technology to connect generations.
Well, and I think love to see more people do that too. If you feel like you want to do this, go through your genealogy, put it on, tell the story of your genealogy. Maybe we can start a little thing here. It could be like, if you go through that process, send it your way. You can repost those and, we could start a trend of people telling more of their stories. What do you think?
And I think that this, if you're listening or watching and you take away one thing, I want you to think about if there's something in your life that you've kind of had on the back burner for a while that you're like, oh, if I had time, I would love to do this thing. For me, it was I would love to capture the stories of my family because growing up, it was such a huge part of, this ancestor did something pretty cool. And this person you should probably know their story as well. And these technologies made this accessible for me. And so this is not just a call to like use AI, try it out, but it's more of, how might you be stuck on something that you're actually motivated to do? And how can you get unstuck? Try something, explore the tech that you have at your fingertips. And yeah, I think that's a great idea, Alec. And I just wanted to add on because I thought, this call to action, hopefully it's a fun one.
I think so. And where can they find you?
So I have a Substack that is called Folklore for the Future, and it's really about, again, preserving the stories of our family, but telling them in a way that future generations can get interested in. So find me there and stay tuned because there'll be more stories, not just about the founders of the town, but also of real people and the way that they tackle issues in their lives of how do they find a meaningful career or build a family. And hopefully this can be applicable to your life and motivate you to dig into your family as well, because it's been a really meaningful way to connect with the past and bring it alive today.
And subscribe to Lauren's Substack. We'll
Hey,
put it
thanks,
in the
Alex.
description below, so it should be easy to find. And also, there's an Annovation Substack too. If you would like to read some of those stories, I do AI explorations on there, and I think we'll be doing some type of crossover post too, because this stuff is fun. It's very interesting, and it gets the core of technology, which is just how can you use technology to amplify your work, whatever your work is. If it is a fun project, if it is a work project that is more, you know, entrepreneurial, business oriented, or job oriented, there's all kinds of ways that you can use technology. Technology is the tools that we use to build things, so make sure you're using the cutting edge tools and always updating them as you can. All right. Well, that is a wrap, and I will play us out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alec.
Absolutely. If I can find it, I always struggle finding this little podcast outro. There it is. All right. Set it to the right volume. There it is. All right, we will see you all next time. So dancey.
It is. It's really fun.
I'll have to make a longer version at some point.